Welcome to Reformed Thinking and to today's deep dive.
Yeah, I am really looking forward to this one.
So I want you to imagine for a second finding out that the most critical document in your life, maybe a will left by a family member or the deed to your house, just does not actually exist.
That would be pretty terrifying, honestly.
Right, or even a historical text you base your entire worldview on. The original is just gone, lost to history.
Yeah, completely vanished.
And all you have are thousands of copies made by hand over hundreds of years, and no two are identical. You would probably panic, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You would wonder if someone slipped a fake clause into the deed, you know?
Yeah, or if the will you are holding is a totally different document from what was originally written. Well, today we are looking at a situation very much like that.
Because when you think about reading a historical religious document, there is this default assumption of pristine preservation.
Yes, like an ancient king's decree carved into a solid slab of granite. You look at that rock and say, well, there it is, the original.
It is clean, visible, and categorized.
But when you step into the world of New Testament textual history, that stone tablet just shatters. The autographs, the physical parchment the Apostle Paul or the Apostle John actually wrote on, they are gone.
They're completely gone. We are looking at a historical landscape that is, quite honestly, a massive tangled web of hand-copied fragments.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of a vast sea of scattered evidence.
We do not have pristine original documents sitting in a museum under a pane of bulletproof glass somewhere. What we have is a massive collection of generations of copies called the Apocrypha.
And for a lot of people, the immediate reaction to that reality is fear.
Which is a completely natural reaction. I mean, for anyone who bases their life, their ethics, and their hope on these texts, that realization can be really jarring.
If you are listening to this right now, you are probably asking yourself, how can I trust a book when the original is missing and the copies we do have contain variations?
Yeah, that is the big question.
So, our mission for this deep dive is to tackle that question head on. We're going to dig into two highly detailed source essays today, from Manuscript to Modern Edition and kept pure in all ages.
To set the table for our discussion, we have to look at two dual realities presented in our sources.
Okay, what is the first reality?
On one hand, you have the theological conviction of divine inspiration, the belief that God authored these words.
Right, the core belief.
But then on the other hand, you have the gritty, physical, historical reality of scribal transmission across centuries of wars, weather, and human frailty.
So our goal today is to help you, the listener, move from any sense of fear or skepticism about those manuscript variations toward an informed, objective trust in the recovered text.
Precisely. We want to show that the messy reality of history is actually what secures the text.
So let's start with the theological framework, because that is where the sources begin. They point us to a historical document called the Westminster Confession of Faith, specifically Chapter 1, Section 8.
Yeah, that is a crucial starting point.
It states that the original Hebrew and Greek texts were immediately inspired by God. That is the first claim.
Right.
But it makes a second claim, which is that these texts were kept pure in all ages by God's singular care and providence.
And that distinction between the lost original autographs and the recovered copies, well, it is a massive paradigm shift.
How so? What does that practically mean for us?
When the confession speaks of the text being kept pure in all ages, it does not mean God made medieval scribes magically infallible.
Oh, right. Preservation does not equal perfect, error-free human copying.
Exactly. God did not put a supernatural force field around every monk with a quill.
That is a great image, honestly.
Instead, the sources argue that God used secondary causes to maintain the text.
So that includes the physical labor of monastic copyists, right?
Yes, and the historical transmission of the church, and even the rigorous, sometimes tedious work of modern textual critics sorting through fragments. Providence works through ordinary history.
Hang on, I am doing a little thought experiment here. If I believe God breathed out these precise texts and he has the ability to do anything, why wouldn't he just miraculously protect every single copy from any spelling error or dropped word?
That is a fair question.
Why use fallible secondary causes at all? Why not just give us a golden book that never decays?
That is a very common sentiment, and the sources address it directly. Demanding a flawless, error-free copy history is an artificial, modern expectation.
We want that pristine stone tablet because it feels safer.
Yeah, exactly. But the essays argue that the sheer abundance of independent copies, scattered across regions and languages, actually provides a far stronger defense against corruption.
Oh, I see. Think of it like a decentralized network.
Right. If there were only one perfect line of manuscripts locked in a single vault in Rome or Jerusalem, a corrupt authority could easily walk in, alter a key doctrine, and lock the vault back up.
Wow, yeah. Everyone would be forced to accept the forgery because there would be nothing to compare it against.
So because the copies multiplied independently, the errors multiplied in different directions.
The errors went in different directions, which makes it impossible for a single editor or a single corrupt church leader to hijack the entire tradition.
Precisely. You'd have to track down thousands of manuscripts spread across 3 continents and change them all at the exact same time without leaving a trace.
That is basically impossible. So the messy abundance is the very thing that secures the objective text.
It really is.
Hmm.
A decentralized text is an unhackable text.
That makes a lot of sense. And the sources contrast this view against 3 modern errors to show why grasping this concept is so vital.
Yeah, let's break those down.
First, they point to liberal deconstructive theories. These assume the text is just a lost byproduct of political struggles in the early church, and we can never really know what the apostles wrote.
Right, which just leads to total skepticism.
Second, they highlight the Roman Catholic reliance on an unwritten tradition and an infallible magisterium.
Historically, their argument was that because the Greek text had transmission errors and was messy, ordinary people could not figure it out.
So the idea was, therefore, you need the church hierarchy to dictate doctrine apart from textual evidence.
And third, the sources bring up modern charismatic mysticism. This is the desire to seek immediate new revelations or signs outside the closed written canon.
And the authors of our sources maintain that by affirming a providentially preserved written text, you are protected from all 3 of those extremes.
You really are. You do not have to give up and say the text is lost. You do not have to surrender your conscience to a church hierarchy, and you do not have to chase emotional, subjective revelations.
You are anchored to the objective historical words, which means if God uses secondary historical causes to preserve the text, we have to look closely at those historical causes.
Yeah, the actual scribes themselves.
Right. The men sitting in cold rooms by candlelight, dropping ink onto parchment. I want to talk about how scholars actually sort through all this physical material because the methods are fascinating.
The methods are brilliant, honestly. This brings us into what is known as the classical method.
And what often surprises people is that biblical textual criticism actually has secular origins.
It does. During the Renaissance and the Reformation, humanist scholars became obsessed with recovering ancient Greek and Latin literature.
They were digging up old poems, philosophies, and histories, right?
Yeah, but they found that a lot of these classical texts had been corrupted by centuries of sloppy copying. So they had to invent a science to clean them up.
And in the process, they learned how to spot massive historical frauds, like the donation of Constantine.
That is the classic example. The donation of Constantine was a document that claims the Roman Emperor Constantine transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope in the 4th century.
Which is a huge political claim.
Massive. For hundreds of years, the church used this document to justify its vast political and territorial claims.
But a scholar named Lorenzo Valla looked at it in the 15th century and realized something was wrong.
Yes, Valla analyzed the language. He noticed the document used Latin words and phrasing that did not exist in the 4th century.
Oh, wow. So it would be like finding a supposed letter from George Washington where he talks about checking his smartphone.
That is a great comparison. Valla used historical and linguistic anachronisms to prove the document was a medieval forgery.
And that critical, analytical spirit laid the groundwork for scholars in the 19th century.
It absolutely did.
I know the text highlights a German scholar named Karl Lachmann from that era. If you are listening right now, you might wonder why you need to care about a 19th century classical scholar, but his method is really the baseline for everything we do with the New Testament today.
Lachmann brought incredible scientific rigor to a field that was previously just based on guesswork. He formalized the classical method using 2 primary procedures.
Let's walk through those. The first one is called recensio, or recension, right?
Right. This is the systematic gathering and weighing of all available manuscript evidence to find the most trustworthy witnesses.
You do not just grab the first manuscript you find, you collect them all and weigh their reliability.
Exactly. And the second procedure is emendatio, or emendation. That is the attempt to correct any remaining errors within those best witnesses using logic and contextual clues.
Lachmann also introduced a concept called stemmatics, which is basically drawing a family tree of manuscripts.
That is correct. Stemmatics is governed by a very simple but brilliant insight.
Which is?
If multiple manuscripts share the exact same unique error, they almost certainly descended from a common ancestor that introduced that error.
Let's say 10 manuscripts all misspell the same town name in the exact same weird way.
Yeah, it is highly unlikely 10 independent scribes made the exact same random mistake.
What happened is that one scribe made the mistake and the other 9 copied from his manuscript.
By tracking those shared mistakes, scholars could map out the genealogical relationships of the surviving witnesses and build a stemma, or a family tree.
I'm going to try an analogy here to see if I have this right. Think of this like a genetic quirk in a family.
Okay, I like where this is going.
If you have 3 siblings and they all have the exact same rare genetic trait, you do not count that as 3 independent sources of the trait. You trace it back to their shared parent.
Right, that is basic genetics.
So if 100 manuscript copies from one specific monastery in Greece all have the same added sentence, they do not outvote 2 older copies from entirely different continents that lack the sentence.
That analogy captures the logic flawlessly. This leads to the golden rule of stemmatics. Manuscripts must be weighed, not counted.
Because just counting the surviving documents gives you a completely distorted view of the history.
Yeah, you might have 1,000 copies of a bad manuscript and only 5 copies of a good one.
But the sources bring up a massive roadblock when you try to apply this clean, logical family tree to the New Testament. They call it genealogical mixture or contamination.
Contamination makes a clean family tree impossible, unfortunately.
Why is that?
Well, the classical stemmatics model assumes a copyist had one manuscript in front of them and copied it straight through from start to finish. A clean line of descent.
But in the ancient world, scribes were resourceful.
Very. A scribe might be copying from one manuscript, but checking his work against a second or third manuscript nearby.
Wait, if I picture this in a modern setting, it is like playing a massive, chaotic game of the children's game telephone.
Oh yeah, that is a good way to look at it.
Because usually, telephone goes in a straight line. Person A whispers to person B, who whispers to person C. You can trace the mistake easily.
Right, it is linear.
But contamination is like playing telephone, except person C is allowed to pull out their smartphone and text person F in the other room to see what they heard, and then they mix both versions together before whispering to person D.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. And to make the web even more tangled, a reader might write an alternative phrasing in the margin of a text.
Like a steady note or something.
Yeah, exactly. Then years later, the next scribe who comes along assumes that marginal note was a line of text that accidentally got left out.
Oh no, so he just puts it right in?
Yes, he incorporates it directly into the main body of his new copy. The branches of the family tree start crossing over each other, weaving back and forth.
It becomes an impossibly tangled web.
Absolutely. Because of this cross-fertilization, modern critics cannot rely on strict mathematical family trees for the New Testament.
So what do they do instead?
They are forced to use more flexible, eclectic methods.
Mm-hmm.
They have to stop looking just at the descent of the documents and start evaluating the specific habits of the scribes themselves.
They have to figure out how human beings make mistakes.
Precisely.
I'm curious how they even figure out what a standard mistake looks like. Were these scribes intentionally adding things to make the text sound better, or were they just sloppy?
That is a great question, and our sources outline a huge shift in how scholars understand those scribal habits.
Because for centuries, the standard operating procedure was driven by a Latin phrase, bravior lectio potior.
Right, which means the shorter reading is preferable.
The assumption was that scribes loved to add things.
Yeah, the old assumption was that scribes were basically amateur editors. Scholars thought scribes loved to add liturgical notes or extra explanations, or they would try to harmonize the Gospels.
So if Mark said a story one way and Matthew said it another way, the assumption was that a scribe would add words to Mark to make him sound more like Matthew.
Exactly. So for a long time, if a textual critic saw a short version of a verse and a long version, they automatically assumed the short one was the original.
But our sources detail how that assumption got completely turned upside down.
It really did.
In 1914, an Oxford scholar named Albert C. Clark challenged this rule.
Through his intense study of classical manuscripts, Clark argued that accidental omission was actually far more common than deliberate addition.
I love the analogy he used. He compared scribes to travelers who lose a piece of luggage at every stop. They just slowly drop words along the journey.
Clark's work was groundbreaking. He pointed out a mechanical error called homoteluton, which is a Greek term for eye skip.
Let's walk through how this happens visually.
Okay, imagine a scribe is copying a paragraph. He is looking at a line ending in the word light.
He looks down at his blank page, dips his quill, and writes the sentence.
When he looks back up at the source manuscript, his eye catches the word light again. But this time it is the word light 3 sentences further down the page.
So he just keeps writing from that second light, completely skipping everything in between.
Precisely. The words in the middle just vanish from the historical record in that manuscript line.
And this was not just a clever theory by Clarke.
No, not at all. The text points to the later empirical research of James R. Royce.
Royce did an incredibly grueling study of the earliest surviving Greek papyri, specifically documents known as P45, P46, and P66.
Right, those are some of the oldest witnesses we have.
What did Royce actually find when he looked at those specific papyri?
He proved Clarke was right. Royce showed that the earliest scribes, working under incredibly difficult physical conditions, poor lighting, fatigue, cold weather, they skipped small words constantly.
They dropped pronouns, conjunctions, and short phrases.
It was human error, plain and simple. The earliest scribes were not deliberately expanding the text, they were accidentally shrinking it.
Hang on. I have to push back here, because I am doing the math in my head based on something our sources address directly.
Go for it.
It is called the majority text theory. If 90% of the manuscripts we have found are from the Byzantine tradition, shouldn't majority rule?
I see where you're going with this.
Like if 1,000 witnesses say the getaway car was red and 2 witnesses say it was blue, I am trusting the 1,000.
Sure, that makes logical sense on the surface.
So if you have thousands of copies saying one thing and handful of older papyri saying another, why wouldn't we trust the 90%?
That logic sounds solid, but the sources dismantle it completely by looking at geopolitical history.
You cannot just look at the numbers. You have to look at what was happening in the world during the early centuries of the church.
Exactly. The transmission of the early text was completely shattered by massive historical upheavals.
Paint that picture for us. What happened to the early manuscripts?
In AD 303, the Roman Emperor Diocletian launched a massive empire-wide persecution, specifically targeting Christian scriptures.
Imperial soldiers were actually dispatched to find and burn the books.
This decimated the early manuscript collections across the empire. If a church had a pristine collection of first-century copies, there's a very high chance they were thrown into a bonfire.
And it gets even more dramatic a few centuries later.
It does. In the 7th century, the Islamic conquests swept through North Africa, Egypt, and Syria.
Those regions were the homes of the ancient core Christian centers like Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem.
The conquests effectively wiped out the infrastructure for Greek manuscript copying in those massive territories. The scriptoriums were destroyed or repurposed, and Greek ceased to be the dominant language there.
So Greek copying only survived in a very specific localized area, the borders of the Byzantine Empire.
That is the crucial insight that dismantles the majority text argument.
Because the sheer number of Byzantine manuscripts is an accident of geography and political isolation?
Spot on. Constantinople was essentially the only region left on Earth that continued to copy Greek texts on an industrial scale through the Middle Ages.
The rest of the world moved on. The West adopted Latin, and the East moved to languages like Coptic, Syriac, and eventually Arabic.
So if you synthesize this data, adding up thousands of Byzantine manuscripts does not yield independent support for their specific readings.
It just proves they were copied a lot in one isolated place over and over again.
That is right. It is not proof of original purity. It goes right back to the golden rule we talked about earlier. You have to weigh the manuscripts, not just count them.
That is completely clear now. But that raises a massive logistical problem. How do you even begin to weigh thousands of Byzantine manuscripts?
Yeah, that is the huge headache. Early on, scholars did it very clumsily. They just compared everything to the Textus Receptus, which was the standard printed Greek text from the 1500s.
And the sources point out why that was a terrible way to handle the data.
Why is that?
Well, if a newly discovered manuscript differed from the Textus Receptus, scholars grouped it into a family based on those differences, but that completely ignored all the places where the manuscripts agreed.
It gave a totally distorted picture of the data.
It was like categorizing a group of people based only on the specific days they call in sick to work, while ignoring the fact that they all work in the exact same building for the exact same company.
That is a brilliant analogy. To fix that, scholars had to get incredibly precise. The text introduces the quantitative method developed by Ernest C. Colwell.
How does the quantitative method actually work in practice?
Colwell realized you had to compare manuscripts completely against one another, calculating the total percentage of agreement across the entire text.
Not just where they deviated from a 16th century printed book.
Right. He established a mathematical baseline. For manuscripts to be considered part of the same text-type family, they needed to show at least 70% agreement in their variations.
That quantitative method sounds brilliant for small groups of early documents.
It was, definitely.
But if you have thousands of late Byzantine manuscripts, sitting down and manually calculating 70% agreement for every single word in the New Testament would take lifetimes.
It was way too slow. So scholars Paul McReynolds and Frederick Wyss developed a highly efficient system called the Claremont profile method.
I am trying to picture this method. Let's use an analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine you have 1,000 different versions of a chocolate chip cookie recipe. Instead of reading every single ingredient of every single recipe to see if they match, you just check a few specific variables.
Oh, I see.
You look at step 4 to see if they use baking soda or baking powder. You look at step 6 to see if they use milk chocolate or dark chocolate.
Right.
By checking just 3 or 4 specific steps, you instantly know which family the recipe belongs to without having to read the whole page.
That is precisely what they did. Instead of collating an entire manuscript word for word, McReynolds and Wyss found specific profiles in the Gospel of Luke, where the various Byzantine subgroups were known to diverge.
By checking those highly specific test spots, they could categorize a late Greek witness into its proper subgroup in just 30 minutes.
30 minutes. That is incredible efficiency compared to spending months on a single scroll.
And the text also mentions Bart D. Ehrman's comprehensive profile method, which tracked patristic citations.
Yeah, that involves looking at how the early church fathers quoted the texts in their sermons and letters.
But even with all these clever profiles, all of this manual sorting eventually hit a wall. Human beings get tired, which leads to the digital revolution.
The shift to computers was monumental for textual criticism.
Before this, human collators were comparing texts by hand, which inevitably introduced new human errors into the data.
A scholar looking at two manuscripts could easily fall victim to the exact same eye skip that plagued the ancient scribes.
Then came software like Peter Robinson's collate program. How does collate change the game?
Scholars could enter exact transcriptions of individual manuscripts into a digital database, and the computer would instantly calculate every single position of variation.
It aligns the texts perfectly.
Yes, the software does not get tired, it does not need a coffee break, and it never suffers from eye skip.
It is amazing how digital databases shattered the physical limits of printed books.
It really did open up entirely new possibilities.
If you look at a printed critical edition of the Greek New Testament, the big, thick books scholars carry around, the editor has to make permanent physical choices about what goes on the page as the main text and what gets relegated to tiny footnotes at the bottom.
But digitally, the limitations of the physical page vanish.
You can instantly swap your base text. You can click hypertext links that take you directly to high-resolution color photographs of the actual papyri sitting in a library vault in Europe.
You can zoom right in on the ink strokes.
This raises a vital question, though. Why does all this digital mapping matter for the person sitting in the pew on a Sunday morning?
The sources make a direct theological application here. This technology is not just dry math or academic trivia for people with PhDs.
It functions as a direct defense of the objective, historical, closed canon.
That is a huge point. We live in an era of massive cultural drift.
We live in a time of subjective emotionalism where people often treat truth as fluid. They say, well, that is your truth, this is my truth.
But the Christian faith is anchored in historical events and specific recorded words.
By utilizing digital tools to map, categorize, and purge copyist errors, the Church anchors itself to an objective, verifiable text.
You are not basing your faith on a feeling in your gut. You are basing it on a text that has been scrutinized, tested, and verified by the most rigorous scientific methods available.
Which brings us from the mechanics of manuscripts to the biblical mandate driving all of this intense effort.
The essays point us to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 14 through 17.
This is the Apostle Paul's final canonical letter to a younger minister named Timothy. Paul is facing execution, and he gives Timothy a clear command.
He tells him to continue in the sacred writings.
And the word continue there is fascinating. It means to abide in a settled sphere.
Paul is telling Timothy not to drift into the religious novelty of his day. He must stay anchored in the written text.
And Paul grounds this command in the very nature of the text itself. He uses the Greek word theopneustos, which translates to God-breathed.
And the sources highlight a very specific nuance about that word.
What is that nuance?
The text was breathed out by God at its origin. It is not that a human being wrote an ordinary book, and then God came along later and breathed a sacred quality into it, making it special.
The divine origin is what gives the text its absolute authority.
Because it is God-breathed, Paul outlines a sequence of utility for the text. The sources detail 4 distinct ministries of the word.
These are not just abstract ideas, this is how the text operates in real life. Let's break down those 4 ministries because they are incredibly practical.
Sounds good.
The first one is didascalia.
Didascalia is teaching truth. It establishes the baseline of reality.
It tells you who God is, who man is, and how the universe actually works. It sets the standard.
The second is elegmos.
Elegmos is reproof. That is the negative function of the text.
Right. It exposes sin and uncovers error. When a person deviates from the baseline established by didascalia, the text acts like a mirror to show them where they are wrong.
The third is epanorthosis.
Epanorthosis is correction. Literally, the Greek implies setting upright something that has fallen over.
Reproof tells you that you are on the wrong path. Correction grabs you by the collar and sets you back on the right path.
And the fourth is paideia.
Paideia is training in righteousness. It is the long-term cultivation of righteous habits.
Once you are back on the path, paideia builds the spiritual muscles to keep you walking on it over time.
The sequence is incredibly pastoral. It teaches you the truth, exposes where you went wrong, restores you to the right position, and trains you to stay there.
So, connecting this back to the hard science of textual criticism we just discussed, recovering the exact wording is absolutely necessary because those specific words carry these specific ministries.
We need the right words to equip the man of God, the minister, for public reading and preaching.
You cannot do epanorthosis, correction, if you are fuzzy on what the text actually says.
That is completely right. If the words are fluid, the correction is fluid.
But the sources provide a vital caution here.
Oh, what is the caution?
All of this textual certainty, all this meticulous recovery, all the digital databases and classical schematics mean nothing if they miss the Christological center.
What do you mean by the Christological center?
Paul tells Timothy that these sacred writings are able to make him wise for salvation, specifically through faith in Christ Jesus.
Ah, I see. The entire point of the text is to reveal the incarnate Son.
A scholar could possess a flawless, mathematically verified, perfectly reconstructed Greek manuscript, but if that text does not lead them to trust Jesus Christ, it has not fulfilled its saving purpose.
It just becomes an academic idol.
Exactly. The text must lead to Christ.
And to show us what this reverence for the text looks like in practice, the sources take us back to an Old Testament prototype of textual recovery and exposition.
We are looking at Nehemiah chapter 8.
I want to spend some time painting this scene because it is so cinematic.
The historical context here is gripping. The year is 444 BC. The Jewish people have returned to Jerusalem after a long, bitter exile in Babylon.
Under Nehemiah's leadership, they have miraculously rebuilt the physical walls of the city in 52 days. They finally have physical security.
But physical security is not enough. The walls are up, but the people are broken inside.
The sources describe a massive covenantal crisis. After decades living in Babylon, generations have passed.
The people have lost their cultural and theological identity. They've forgotten the classical Hebrew language, and they are completely ignorant of the law of Moses.
They do not know how to live as God's people anymore.
So a grassroots movement starts. The people themselves gather at the Watergate.
They demand that Ezra the scribe bring out the physical written book of the law, the Sefer Torah Moshe.
Notice what they demand. They do not ask Ezra to give a motivational speech.
They do not ask for a mystical experience, and they do not ask for a new political strategy now that the walls are up.
They demand the objective historical text. And the physical posture of the people when Ezra brings that text out is striking.
The scene is deeply moving. Ezra is standing on an elevated wooden platform above the crowd.
When he physically opens the scroll, the entire congregation, thousands of people, stands up.
They raise their hands toward heaven, they shout, "Amen, amen," and they bow down with their faces to the earth and the dust.
The reverence for the physical text is palpable. They recognize that hearing these words is hearing the voice of God.
But there is a massive practical problem.
What is that?
Ezra is reading classical Hebrew, but the people have been saturated in Aramaic culture during the exile. Aramaic was the trade language of Babylon.
The average person standing in that crowd could not fully understand the Hebrew syntax or vocabulary anymore.
This is where we see the biblical prototype for expository preaching.
The text says the Levites moved through the crowd, giving the sense. The Hebrew terms used are mifarash and some sekel.
Unpack those terms for us. What were the Levites actually doing in the crowd?
They were actively translating the text and explaining its semantic weight so the people could grasp it.
They would take the classical Hebrew phrase Ezra read, translate it into colloquial Aramaic, and explain the context.
They were breaking down the barriers to understanding.
This is such a great analogy for what modern textual critics and Bible translators do today. It is essentially the same job.
Scholars use the Claremont profile method and collate software and linguistic analysis to bridge the gap from an ancient fragmented text to the contemporary mind.
They clear away the debris of history, the scribal errors, and the language barriers, so the listener sitting in a church today can hear the actual voice of the text, just like the people at the Watergate.
And look at the result in Nehemiah 8. It leads to deep, corporate, life-changing action.
When the Levites give the sense, the people weep.
They weep from the conviction of hearing the law and realizing how far they have drifted. Alegmos, reproof, in action.
But the leaders do not let them stay in despair.
No, they're told to stop weeping and rejoice.
Why? Because they finally understood the objective words that were declared to them. The veil of ignorance was lifted.
And that understanding led to immediate obedience. They went out and celebrated the Feast of Booths, aligning their lives with the commands they had just recovered.
They built temporary shelters to remember God's provision in the wilderness, something they had not done properly for generations.
So what does this all mean to us today? Synthesizing everything we have covered from these two essays, the core thesis is incredibly hopeful.
The history of the New Testament is not a story of divine words defeated by human frailty.
It is the story of divine truth carried through human weakness. It has been made accessible to us today by a massive, recoverable abundance of witnesses.
The messy reality of all those manuscripts is the very thing that proves nobody tampered with the core message.
Based on the sources, there are highly practical applications for you listening today.
First, do not fear textual variants. Do not let sensationalist claims you might see online or in a documentary shake you.
When someone claims the Bible has been corrupted by thousands of changes, realize that the massive abundance of manuscripts is a feature, not a bug.
It is the decentralized network that kept the text safe.
Second, pastors must be transparent with their congregations about these manuscript differences.
They should use them as lessons in how God providentially preserved the text, rather than hiding the messy history.
And finally, believers must cultivate a serious hunger for expository preaching.
When you read the text, or when you hear it preached, it should be with the same posture of trembling reverence we saw at the Watergate in Nehemiah.
You are hearing the God-breathed words. That reverence is the logical outcome of understanding the history.
When you know what it took to get this test to you, apathy is no longer an option.
It really isn't.
That brings us to a final thought for you to mull over today. Think about the staggering lengths God went to in this historical narrative.
Orchestrating the rise and fall of empires like Rome and Babylon.
Ensuring the survival of fragile papyri buried under the dry sands of Egypt for centuries.
Guiding the intense, exhausting labor of scholars from Lorenzo Valla to Karl Lockman.
And even guiding the development of modern digital algorithms to track microscopic scribal errors.
All of this historical orchestration occurred to ensure that we possess the precise words of the apostles today.
It is a staggering reality to consider. So, if God went to such lengths to preserve this text across 2 millennia of chaos, what does our daily neglect of reading those words say about our view of his providence?
That is a tough question, but a necessary one.
We are no longer looking for an ancient king's decree carved on a single lost stone tablet. We have something far better.
We have a text fiercely guarded by history, verified by rigorous science, and preserved specifically for you to read today.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time on Reformed Thinking.